Hello, Libra. Welcome to the Sacred Space of Self, your 2018 spring reading. Yep, we're cooking along here, and I've got your solar chart, simplified version above, complex version right underneath that. One thing I'm doing is I'm starting all these readings with a little discussion of what this thing called the solar chart is. Which is basically a simplified chart that is used by public astrologers, people who write things like horoscope columns, and mastered by Linda Goodman. You want an example of somebody who is really, really good at the solar chart? Speaking of solar chart, the sun blazing in here, and I don't have my app yet that's going to help me control the f-stop, so I'm going to just use this chart as a reflector card, which turns out the f-stop. The solar chart is a way to do astrology and get a result where you don't know the person's natal chart or natal positions. It depends entirely on the position of the sun by sign at birth, which becomes a presumed first house. Or you can use your known rising sign and play that reading. The two charts work in parallel. Now, I know this because I know my natal chart well, and because I've followed my transits forever, 20-something years, and because I have followed my solar chart for all these years. And they are like parallel universes that tell the same story in different ways. So if you're not quite following the nuances of this, I would suggest you not get too hung up and just start reading my stuff about the houses. There's a lot that I've written about the houses, and if you're really interested in digging, we can provide you with tons of stuff about the houses, because the houses are where it is at. And the other day I was kind of imagining a metaphor to explain what the solar chart is, and what I came up with is it's kind of like a tarot spread. And the tarot spread is shaped like a chart, and the cards are just the planets where they actually are in the sky, and we put them in, and we get the solar chart. So think of it almost as like when you cast a tarot spread, you're not wondering where the cards are in the sky, right? There's no kind of natural tarot spread. It's just a way of divining, which is what we're doing with this process. We are doing divination, only it is an astrology-based form of divination. And today we're here to talk about two retrograde planets. One will be retrograde at the end of June, and the other will be retrograde at the end of the year. That's Venus. I'm going to put a little emphasis on Venus. Mostly we're going to talk about Mars. And then we're going to talk about the background that tells us what this means, and why this particular Mars retrograde specifically is relevant, and what its context is, right? Because things are meaningful only in context. And so we're going to work with the context of many outer planets that have only recently changed signs. And those outer planets that have changed signs are telling the story of the attitudes and the values of society changing in a way that is exceedingly difficult to see, because we're in the midst of the change. We're swimming in a river that is flowing, and we need to use a special kind of perception to be able to perceive the motion and the movement and the flow and the condition of the water. And the primary thing I want to kind of infuse you with is a sensitivity to figure and background. Now we've done this in Psych 101. Like an example of figure and ground is this card from a deck called Le Jarreau, given to me by an old friend named Liz. And the figure could be seen as the person standing in front of the mountain, about to aspire to whatever goal. The figure could be seen as the mountain. And the background is clearly the rows of clouds in the sky. And so figure and ground are a very important study. Typically, we get caught in the figure, the marionette dancing on the stage, and the magic of puppetry is that you are distracted by the figure. And you can go quite a while forgetting that there's a puppeteer behind the puppet. That Ernie and Bert, have people in there, and sometimes two people working a complex Muppet. And in the case of your astrology, the figure is the retrograde planet. The background, the immediate background, is the sign that the retrograde is in. In the case of Mars, that'll be mostly Aquarius and a little bit of Capricorn. And in the case of Venus, it'll be mostly Scorpio and a little bit of Libra. The background are all of these other planets. Saturn changing signs, Uranus changing signs, Chiron changing signs, Quaoar and Pholus, which I'll get into in a minute, changing signs. Very important for you because they're on the cardinal cross. And all of these outer planets changing signs represent the values and attitudes of society, the technological field in which we live, and all facets of the environment that are typically missed, that are typically invisible till you use a special form of awareness or some special instrument, like a thing that reads electrical waves to perceive them. Otherwise, you don't notice your Wi-Fi modem until it stops working. And while it's working, you're getting toasted by a little microwave light rays, basically. And you don't notice that. Now, you might notice it if you have trouble sleeping, but then again, you might not make the connection to the Wi-Fi modem. So, in this and many ways, the environment is an invisible thing. I learned this, by the way, from studying the work of the McLuhan family, Marshall and Eric, and talking to Andrew. All right, so let's consider what's going on. First of all, let's focus on what I think is the single most important development in your natal solar chart, which is that Chiron right here has entered your 7th house. So in this chart, this is you. You're standing here and you're looking in that direction over at the western horizon. The western horizon and the eastern horizon are reversed. South, north, west, east. It's flipped. And you now have Chiron in your 7th solar house, Aries, which is about relationships. This is going to take 9 years to go through Aries. It's taken about 8 years to go through Pisces. You experienced that. You felt that. Uranus, meanwhile, has changed signs recently, last week, from Aries to Taurus. It took 7 years to go through Aries. You experience that. It has been an unusual 7 years in your relationships, and potentially a time of many transitions, potentially a seemingly challenging or unstable time, as if it was difficult for you to kind of hold anyone down or to engage with people who didn't kind of turn your world upside down in some way. Now, my hunch is that those particular challenges of the past 7 years of Uranus in Aries are going to cool off. You still have Uranus in your chart. It's gone from house 7 to house 8. House 7 is a relationship chart. House 8 is a relationship chart, except for one little thing. When Uranus, this planet, was in your 7th house, it was making a lot of aspects, particularly to Pluto and to Eris, which I haven't included in this chart. It's right about there. And so Uranus, through your 8th house, which we'll get to in a second, is a whole different thing, I think much more manageable transit. And Chiron, now in your main partnership house, the 7th, is here to restore some stability and to help you gain some grounding, to do some healing work that goes way, way earlier, healing work on issues that go way earlier than the past 7 years, back to the beginning of your life and possibly past life things. And Chiron is holding a very powerful, what you might call true mirror to your face. So you can see something about yourself. And my sense is that this will be a reflection that you appreciate, even if Chiron is pointing out the reasons, or potential reasons that you face certain challenges over the past 7 years. And so Chiron's, I would say, if we could ascribe intent to an inanimate object or mythological being or archetype, is to help you open up lines of communication that specifically address the matter of healing within your partnerships, rather than just kind of partnership for its own sake. Most people just do partnership for its own sake. There's not a lot of sense of mission, of meaning and purpose in our partnerships. This is just kind of typical. We want company, we want sex, we want help with the rent. Those are the main reasons. And a lot of things we call love end up feeling like, being like, something not necessarily so loving. All right. And when we talk about healing, we're talking about going back to the roots of love and kind of planting ourselves there. So with Chiron in the 7th, you're in this situation where relationship must have a purpose. And I mean, I have an expression, all dogs need jobs. And I extend the concept of all dogs needing jobs to all relationships needing jobs. And my concern is that a lot of relationships don't have jobs, and as such, they can lose their way, because we need that sense of purpose and necessity. All right. Thing one, Uranus going into your 8th, kind of a big thing too. This is a bit of a perplexing transit, because Taurus, on the first 10 layers in, is about stability and structure. It's a little bit like Capricorn, only in some ways more Capricorn than Capricorn. And Uranus rebels against the status quo. And so in many ways, Taurus is the status quo. I mean, when I need help maintaining the status quo in some way, or figuring out the way things should be, I usually go to a Taurus. Taurians are very good at keeping things right, stable, consistent, persistent, and doing them well. You happen to have this sign in your house of deep, committed, bonded relationships. And so one of the reasons why Libra is the sign of relationships, kind of archetypally, is partly about itself, that it's the seventh sign, it's the opposite Aries, the sign of self, and it's the sign of we share kind of a common reality, but it's aided and abetted by having Taurus on the 8th, which gives a kind of a profound sense of commitment. And then along comes Mr. Uranus and says, well, no, not necessarily. Commitment is going to have a new idea, a new concept, a new meaning. That could be exciting. It could be frightening. What it really means is that because Uranus is the planet of inventions, and while I'm saying that, I want to just show you one of my favorite examples of Uranus being the planet of inventions. I know I mentioned this. I'm always threatening to do this chart. In the flight of the chart of the first airplane flight, see that? Uranus is conjunct the Sun, and the Moon is about to make a conjunction to the Sun and Uranus. There's about to be a new Moon conjunct Uranus. And two guys out at the beach flipped a coin, and Wilbur, I guess, got to fly the airplane around, and people flew around up in the sky. And Uranus was there. New Moon conjunct Uranus. So in that and other ways, Uranus is the sign of inventions. And here is the perfect symbol of reinventing the concept of commitment in a way that works for you, whatever that means for you. And it will help liberate you from commitments that are too staid, too stable, too fixed, unable to respond to your creativity. Potentially commitments where there's not enough room for other people, whether those other people are other lovers, whether those other people are friends, whether those other people are acquaintances, whatever they might be. Uranus in the 8th is going to help you make room for other people and for an expanded concept of what it means to be committed. So you can be sensitive to your need to invent and create something for yourself that works for you. All right, now let's bring in a retrograde. That's your first solar house. Aquarius is your 5th solar house. The sign Aquarius is about two things mainly. One is groups, and the other is social patterns. And then social patterns has got a big definition because our whole culture is in some way social, and we have many dimensions of patterns, and the social patterns we live by include things like the internet, since most of our socializing is in some way involves the internet, we are caught in this ridiculous web of social patterns that are filtered through the internet, where there's very little we can do at all, including having lunch, that does not get processed through some electronic pattern maker robot, Aquarius. And so you're going to have Mars retrograde, Mars, the planet of desire, planet of passion, violence, aggression, to some extent curiosity, retrograde in Aquarius, shaking up the patterns that you follow, particularly in the 5th house. Romance, sex play, art, basically anything fun or experimental. The interesting thing about both retrograde planets this year is that one rules your relationship house, Mars, and one rules your first house, you, Venus. And so what you may find, consistent with having Chiron, which is always about distinction, people who stand out, people who are different, people who are mavericks, people who don't quite go with the flow and go with the grain of society and do everything they're supposed to do. On your 7th, indicating innovation in your relationships, indicating unusual people, unusual teachers, people who are distinct, but not in the Uranian way, where they might be fleeting or come and go or not necessarily be honest. The Chiron type people are more the type to be teachers, mentors, or rebels specifically with a purpose, a cause, a need to do something associated with healing. So in a sense, Mars represents that. Chiron and Mars would be working together, as they often do, because Mars is kind of displaced by Chiron. I'm not sure which is the dispositor, but anyway. And it lands in a region of your chart where you want to have fun, you want to be creative, but because the sign involved is Aquarius, which can be very serious and have highly focused patterns, it's not that easy to do things that are different and to be experimental. And Mars is like going to kind of put the motorboat in reverse and have a big experiment. All right. And this means taking different kind of chances, engaging with different kinds of people, and challenging the rules. Challenging, for example, the limits on how much fun you're supposed to have. Challenging the rules on what kinds of sex are socially acceptable to your friends. You might not even be amazed were you to hear the idea that many people set limits on their bliss because they are afraid what people are going to think about the fun they have and judge them. So you're going to get quite the fun trip of going beyond judgment. That's my theory, one of them. Uranus in the 8th also is really about challenging the limits and the traditions. And the 8th up here, going back to this, is about commitment and bonding, but also about the kind of sex you want the very most. And that's going to have something to do with the kind of relationship you need to contain the sex that you want the very most. And so here's where there's this constant dual invention of the creative thing and the relationship that sustains it. And this is showing up a lot of places in your chart. One last point before I peel away the simple chart and show the complicated chart. Venus retrograde in the second. Your planet is Venus. It's kind of hanging out in Cancer now. So through the rest of the year, it's going to go all the way around. It's going to come out to Scorpio. Sometime late in the year, it's going to retrograde. Station retrograde in Scorpio, your second house, and retrograde into Libra. And this is about an experiment in finding your true values, not the hardware store, your actual priorities of living. This is another subject that I kind of talk about casually, that in reality is so alien to normal, typical conversation that it's kind of hilarious that anyone could leave out of life a discussion of the most important priorities, but also a probe, an experiment into understanding what those priorities are and leaving no stone unturned. Meeting the challenge of peeling back the layers of what really means the most to you. And one of the things in there, given that it is Venus retrograde, in your second house of self-love, self-esteem, self-respect, being self-possessed, a lot of self going on there, but it's a bit of an extension from the first house, because the first house is a kind of a lot of an I am to it. There's a lot of labeling going on in the first house. But in the second house, it comes down to actual priorities. And this journey will take you on a quest deep into yourself to the point where it would seem to me you make some major discovery about yourself. Like big. Not an ordinary kind of discovery, a real discovery. All right, here we add a bunch of other planets. I would point out that most of these planets are on this side of the chart. You are probably feeling impacted by existence. The western hemisphere of the chart tends to be the one where we feel impacted. And there are some big players in the Western Hemisphere. We can go through them. These two new discoveries, Saturn, Pluto, Mars, Nessus, Neptune, Chiron, Eris, Uranus, Aspolis. Most of what I'm working with in this reading, almost all of the outer planets, outer planets even going beyond Pluto, are in your Western Hemisphere. So you're in relationship to all of these seeming external factors. And while I don't take the belief that everything that happens to you is a direct projection or exact mirror of your life, I do accept the idea that we need to do our part to claim the things we perceive and witness, and find a correspondence, an orientation within ourselves, so that we take some ownership of like what that person is doing in my life, take some ownership of what that event or experience is really about, as opposed to seeing everything as an external. And it is sometimes astounding to me to even consider how rare it is for anyone to consider this, to consider even an inner life. I mean, if you're the kind of person who's aware you have an inner life and you go through life marveling at how it's even possible to not have an idea that that exists, you know what I'm talking about. And a lot of the spiritual path, what we call the spiritual path, is cultivating an inner life so that we may cultivate maturity, so that we're not striving to be enlightened as much as we're striving to be adults. Right? Because I think this is, I agree, this idea was handed to me by my friend Kasia Urbaniak, that we don't really want enlightenment. We want to be grown-ups. Now, for you, a very important part of being a grown-up is distinguishing yourself from your family. Of all the signs right now, in the top 2 that are working out family legacy, which is saying a lot because all 12 signs are in some way dealing with the issue of family legacy, family influence, and the control the family has over us, the struggle to be independent that so many people are feeling. Libra's right up there in the top 2, and the reason is, look at all this going on in your house of family, and notice that the creative quest of Mars retrograde in Aquarius dips back into Capricorn just a little bit when it ends. And so in seeking your creative freedom, your sexual freedom, your freedom to have fun and play and be alive, one of the things you're going to do is find that freedom in an element of liberation from your family. And this is something you have been working at for a decade. In reality, crashing my ear there, the pencil, bad habit, I know. One of the most formative times of this liberation from family was 01 to 05. Right after 9/11, Chiron goes in to your 4th house. Simpler times. And Chiron skates across the 4th house for 4 years. And you were given an agenda. You were given a kind of a mission, a learning mission. You were shown illustrations of the ways you needed to be free. Chiron left, moved on, slowed down, went into Aquarius, passed through Aquarius, went into Pisces, just finished that. And then Pluto arrived in 2008 and picked up the agenda. So one of my questions for you is, what was going on from 01, late 01 into 05 that called your attention to something that you needed to do or be or become? That, even if it's one thing that you learned, one parallel you made between, for example, an early childhood situation and a household situation, One thing is all you need. One little clue. One little bit of kind of prioritization. There are quite a few important points in your solar fourth now. Pholus, Quaoar, 2 points deeply involved with family constellation. And Saturn, which is like clearing space, clearing out the space that you were left with a kind of a clutter in your, yes, still got sound, ancestral home. You might say baggage left behind from your family of origin that you were still dragging around, still may be dragging around, cluttering up your life, cluttering up your space. And this combination of Pluto and Saturn is like a demolition team, going through an old New York City apartment, and like clearing out the space and suddenly turning it into this magnificent room. Unlike the pattern of much of the 20th century, where the big, beautiful places were cut up into small places, you're doing the opposite. You're taking the small, cramped, cluttered spaces and opening them up. While you're doing this, you are finding interesting things in the basement. And a whole huge topic of Libra astrology, which I covered in The Art of Becoming 2018 annual reading, because in writing, you can devote like 1,000 words to something, is what the nature of that ancestral baggage is and what the nature of the cleanup process is. But know that it is there, and know that much of what you were dealing with you have inherited. Don't take blame for having made it, created it, having not dealt with it, not done enough therapy. Once you're aware of the issues, you can do the therapy and claim it and own it and then throw it out if you need to. But be advised that you're dealing with a lot of stuff that is not actually yours. You didn't do it. It's not your karma. Some of it is, but somewhere like 60, 70, 80, 90% of it is not your karma. So that's a special condition when you're dealing with a lot of stuff that's not yours. What do you do with it? Well, the people who it belongs to are dead. What do you do with it? So one of the things you can do is know as much as you can about them. Another thing you can do is establish a relationship with those dead people. Think about them. Put their pictures up. Consider what information they passed down the family lineage. Any potential, let's say, for example, lack of trust. Lack of trust of men. Lack of trust of women. Lack of trust of money. Alcohol-related subject matter is a big one. Big one. You will learn, if you were to just study the history of alcohol in your family, you would have a massive education. It would be enough for 2 solid years of growth in spiritual work. The impact on, for example, relationships and maturity. Think about this. Capacity for intimacy. The crisis of security, all related to alcohol. Most probably, your dad's side of the family, though when we're looking at houses 4 and 10, in a natal chart or a solar chart, check for both parents. But typically, house 4 is the house of fathers, house 10, the house of mothers. Some confusion, by the way, coming from your mother's side of the family. One thing I want to just point out in closing, and remind Libras, which I remind Libras as many, 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 many times as I can, is that of all the signs, Libras are the most, let's say, psychosomatic. Now that word used to be an insult. When I first heard that word, it was an insult. It meant bullshit. What psychosomatic really means is that the mind influences the body. That if you are upset by something, that can mess with you physically. Your boss yells at you. You might get up the next morning feeling so sick you can't go to work. And you're actually sick. So be aware that you have this very quick transposition of psycho, which means emotional, mental, psychic, to somatic, which means the body. And you have Neptune in this house right now. And Nessus in this house, which is a kind of a thing that says, look for the impact of abuse legacy on your health. And Neptune in the 6th house of health in Pisces, which is enhancing this psychosomatic quality, is being squared by Asbolus, which to me is saying that part of the psychosomatic kind of quest or struggle is spiritual survivalism. Asbolus, this little guy here, which I don't talk about enough, but I watch him. One of the 4th centaur. The centaurs in order are discovered Chiron, then there's a long gap, Pholus 92, Nessus 93, Asbolus 94, Cariclo 95. It's like one a year after Pholus, and then now there's like 75 of them. And Asbolus is a kind of a survivalism. So one last thought. Consider the way in which your family's orientation on so-called spiritual, more likely religious matters, created a kind of toxic urgency where the idea of spiritual may not be even vaguely appealing. But there's a lot there. There's a lot of gifts waiting for you. And if you want to know something about the nature of the urgency, consider your mom. Consider your mom's approach to spirituality. And look at the urgency involved. Like how important or urgent, emergent kind of thing. Okay, that's mainly what I have to say to you. Don't forget, look up your rising sign. Most of you have all 12 signs. When it comes down to individual signs, we'll be sending out upgrades, make it easy to get other ones. You can share this with people you care about, family members, housemates. Normally, I provide 4 of these readings a year. A birthday reading, yours came out back in September or October. The annual, which is in writing, I think that The Art of Becoming was my best annual. I wrote 66,000 words in 7 weeks while writing a daily horoscope. I don't know how the hell I did it. And that is there for you. We've lowered the price, and I try to do my best in this relatively inexpensive reading to condense in as much as you would get from your average natal chart reading. So I do my best. I'm happy to answer questions if you email me at efc@ericfrancis.com. And if you dip around the different readings, find out your rising sign, find out your moon sign, and kind of compare and contrast and let the ideas spark off of one another. Make up your own ideas. I'm merely here to get you started, not to finish. to begin, to plant some seeds, to keep it interesting. Thank you. A pleasure working with you, and I'll see you somewhere else around the zodiac. Bye for now.